Welcome to CP Newsroom. I'm Morgan Lee. Today we'll be talking about the crisis in Sudan from the perspective of women and children, not the traditional voices of politics and economics that we often hear this narrative framed in. To have this experience, I'm joined by Kimberly Smith. She's the co-founder and president of Makeway Partners. Kimberly, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Morgan.
As someone who has spent time learning and studying the Sudanese culture, observing this way of life that they have there, what do you know and appreciate now that you may not have seen the first time you were there?
I remember my first time a decade ago going into Sudan, and at that time it was just one country, Sudan, not North Sudan or Sudan and South Sudan. And I remember riding along on a truck with several military SPLA, Sudanese People's Liberation Army, that were, at that time were considered the rebels. And I happened to use the term civil war. And they looked at me aghast and just started laughing. I had done all kinds of research. I'd read our history books. I'd read what newspaper articles I could find. I had read online to try to educate myself about the situation in Sudan. But all of our history books called it a civil war.
Interesting.
They asked me, would you call it a civil war when Osama bin Laden had attacked the Pentagon or the Twin Towers? What if he had been able to do more than just blow those buildings up? What if he had been able to gain control of the Pentagon? And you formalized a group of people that went in and tried to get back what was yours? Would you call that a civil war? That thought had never entered my Western mind, and it set the stage for me to understand that the people were simply fighting for their freedom to worship and their freedom, the dignity of God that was in them.
I was going to say, it actually kind of reminds me of the situation in Iraq right now, and they talked about the actual nation building part of it, you know, where you have to craft institutions that may not exist right now and give people the kind of conception of government that they may not have. Do you see any of those factors at play right now?
Well, I think that's really what Makeway Partners is all about. We're not seeking political solutions. We see the corruption at the top down. We're not pro-South Sudanese government. We're simply pro the people of Sudan. And so we have this very grassroots effort that is investing in core Christian indigenous leadership, identifying who those leaders are, equipping them, relating with them and empowering them, and then even going beyond that and starting with the whole new generation under them, the orphans. There are nearly 2 million estimated orphans that have been created through this war and devastation. Those children are who Makeway Partners is investing in, and we see them being the future of peacemakers, not foreign peacekeepers, but peacemakers rising up from within.
So back years ago when you first came to this country, what type of steps did you guys take to gain the credibility and respect of the people that you were working with?
Well, it was very difficult, and so particularly me going as a woman alone, it was very difficult, and especially seeing my kawaja, or white Western mentality. I mean, I was obviously immediately exposed as not understanding the culture. And so I just spent, we call it boots on the ground time, and I just spent months at a time with the indigenous people, asking them, learning how to identify with them and just ask them to share their stories with me. What I was really honored and amazed at, because people didn't talk about what had happened, it had just been sort of quietened down. It's too painful to talk about. So I didn't know if I asked people, tell me your story, would they tell? But amazingly, once they were asked, people lined up, literally would line up. Hundreds of them would come every day, waiting in line for just so excited that somebody wanted to hear their story, wanted to know what had happened to them. We brought a Christian doctor from Birmingham, Alabama in back in 2005, I think that it was, and she personally examined more than 1,000 women during her 1 week on the ground. Out of the 1,000 women that she examined, only one had not been raped and genitally mutilated. Out of 1,000 women, one, and it happened to be a very young girl.
Wow, and you have your own story too of being attacked while you were in the country. Can you share a little bit about that?
I do. There was a baby, we called him baby Elijah, that was dying. His mother died in childbirth. They thought from a rabid dog bite, but she died in childbirth. And they brought her to our compound because there are no hospitals. There's no way to take care of a baby. There's no formula. If a mother dies, they normally put a baby in a tukul, one of their mud brick buildings, and just wait for the baby to die. They say it's because the mother is calling from the grave for the baby to be brought back. But of course, that's their way of handling the fact that they have no way to care for these babies. But they heard about me being there on the ground and knew that we had resources, and so they brought the baby to me. We cared for the baby for a couple of months until he was strong enough that we thought maybe he would survive if we tried to reintegrate him into the community. We found a woman who said she would take care of the baby, but after having the baby for a short while, the pressure from the community to put that baby back in the tukul and let him go back to his mother, in other words, send him to the grave, she gave in to that and she left the baby aside. When I learned about that, I didn't know where the baby was, but I knew he was locked in a tukul somewhere, and so I went out trying to find the baby. I'd been searching for, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours, and it was starting to get dark, and I went down to a river bank where I knew our indigenous leader went sometimes, and as I made my way down, I stumbled upon a group of Darfuri refugees. Now, these are not part of the radical Islamic regime that had been invading and committing the persecution. These were actually victims of persecution. They're Muslim, but they're victims of the persecution of ethnic cleansing that had been going on in Darfur for so long, and this was a number of years ago in the height of the Darfur crisis. When they saw me, they didn't know who I was. They didn't know that I was actually trying to help them. And the collective trauma is just so high. There's just this huge anger and violence, repetitive violence. And so they attacked me. They beat me pretty severely, and many of them raped me.
And when you talk about that collective trauma, you're talking about just like a series of never-ending and kind of injustices that people are almost raised off.
That's right. After 6 decades of this extreme and repetitive violence, there's really no one alive who has ever been born into a time of peace and knows what security means. How many of these men have watched, especially the Darfuris, how many of them have watched their wives and daughters and sisters be drug off into sex slavery that is so prevalent from these radical Islamic regimes? What kind of trauma have they suffered, and for how many generations? I think it really does affect, not only spiritually, it affects us mentally and emotionally. It warps our worldview.
For many of the people in my generation that want to go out and kind of respond to what we see as these injustices and atrocities, what type of advice do you have for us?
I might sound like the book of James for a minute, because I'm going to give several don'ts. Don't go alone. Make sure that you have a very strong support base. Make sure that you have go-tos, that you have spiritual directors that are really speaking into your life that are not necessarily involved in the trauma. Because as we experience trauma from the hands of others, it does begin to affect us, even if it's secondary trauma, meaning you just are hearing so many stories or watching so much violence, even if you don't experience it personally. So I say, first of all, proceed with extreme caution. Speak to people who have been, speak to people who really have spent time on the ground, and just very carefully discern how it is that your gifts might line up with such a calling.
So you've given us some of the words of caution if we were going to go, but any type of words of encouragement or ways that we should see ourselves if we do decide to take that leap?
Yes, there are so many positive things that you can do. My belief and what I've seen work is always through the indigenous people, though. So be willing to humble yourself and learn from the indigenous people, just like my story of when I first went in. Even though I'd done all the Western reading, I'd done all the education, I still didn't know what the Sudanese people could teach me. So be willing to humble yourself and put yourself in partnership with indigenous people. But I would also say, do educate yourself from good reading material from people who have boots on the ground time, and there are lots of those people now. Our website will give you, makewaypartners.org, will give you not only our information, but share information from many other secular and Christian resources educating you about how to be prepared and what to expect. I also wrote a book about my experiences and the people of Sudan, what they've been through. It's called Passport Through Darkness, and you can find it at Amazon.com or your local bookstore.
Great. So, you know, we've talked a lot about like the pain that the country or the countries right now is going through. Can you talk too about some of like the hope and the things that the signs that are encouraging you? You just got back from a trip, you know, I'm sure you've seen some of this stuff.
It is so exciting. I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is where I get excited, because a few minutes ago we were talking about the hope is through that next generation, raising up peacemakers. Well, 10 years ago, we literally were taking in orphans on the border of Darfur, that some of them had come from the Darfuri side, some had come from the Dinka southern side. And some of these children, we bring them in to sleep together side by side, and some of them literally knew, this one's father killed my father, or this one's father raped my mother. And they were vowing to kill each other at night as they went to sleep. After 10 years now of consistent daily care, day in and day out, we provide education, food, medical care, discipleship, everything, housing, everything it takes to raise a child in the name of Christ. And we now see those same children 10 years later bowing down and praying for each other as they go to sleep at night. That's the hope for Sudan and South Sudan.
Thank you so much for just ending on this note of what Make Way Partners has accomplished during its time. It's been great to talk to you today, Kimberly. Thank you. For those interested in commenting or questions or anything else that you might want to share with us, please reach us at cpnewsroom@christianpost.com. I'm Morgan Lee, and we'll see you next time.